I'm happy to be here today. I get to have both of my great pleasures, one of which is to talk about a research interest, which the topic of springs sort of invited me to put together, synthesize from lots of different sources and from my own personal experience, a talk which I hope won't be too long and rambly, but it's the kind of talk I really enjoy giving. And then also to actually get in the field and go look at some places and in the landscape, and I'm really excited about this afternoon as well. Thank you, Lucille, for your talk. That was inspiring and definitely connects with some of what I'm talking about as well. I'm coming here today from Canyon, Texas, sometimes called the heart of the Comancheria, at the head of the Paladero Canyon. And my house is sort of on the banks of the Tierra Blanca Draw. So I'm talking about springs today. So here's one definition of a spring. Springs are naturally occurring features that convey excess groundwater to the land's surface. They represent a transition from groundwater to surface water. Water issues through one opening, multiple openings, or numerous seeps in the rock or soil. Here's another somewhat more descriptive. A spring, or its Spanish equivalent, ojo, widely used in the southwest United States, is a natural flow of fresh water from the Earth's surface, generally issuing strongly under its own pressure onto land or into a body of water. Where the flow is not distinct but dispersed, it is more correctly termed a seep. Springs are characterized by temperature, prevalence, and mineral content, as well as taste and smell, and their presence often informs place names. Spring, the English word, comes from sorry, I got my slides mixed up. Spring in English comes from Germanic roots into Anglo-Saxon or Old English, sprink or sprang, and seems to have developed more or less simultaneously as a noun, that is a place where water emerges, and a verb, meaning to gush or spring forth or leap forth. In some obsolete senses, the term was used to denote a crack or fissure, while a spring in architecture referred to a point from which the arch or vault rises. The etymology is intriguing in Spanish as well. The first definition of ojo, of course, is eye, but the whole phrase, el ojo de agua, or eye of water, is interesting. Roundness seems like an important feature here, as ojo also is used to refer to the eye of a needle or a hurricane. Ojo and oculus are related as well, the oculus being that round hole in the center of a dome in architecture. I'll resist getting into the metaphor of water and tears for the purposes of discussing ojo, but eyes are, we often say, the windows to the soul. When it comes to los ojos and springs, thinking of that as a window, I wonder, are we looking in or is something looking out? This reminds me of the prevalence of springs as sacred locations, the genius loci or spirit of place that for ancient Greeks and Romans were associated with guardian spirits and with sites where water flowed like a generous blessing out of the earth to sustain human life and livelihood. A famous example is the Castilian spring at Mount Parnassus in Greece. The spring issues from rocky earth from between two cliffs near Delphi, associated with Apollo. Visitors ritually washed and drank from the spring before continuing to consult the oracle. The site was also known to Roman poets as a source of divine inspiration. One can, I think, readily intuit the relationship between springs and the sacred. The springhead marks the emergence place of mysterious subterranean waters, and water of course, is essential to all life. And of course, springs are important the world over, including in indigenous America. Springs were sacred sites in what we today call the American Southwest, associated with symbolism of the snake, which perhaps symbolized the entrenched meanders of canyon rivers. In her 1977 classic novel, Ceremony, Leslie Marmon Silko describes a spring like this. Quote, "The dark orange sandstone formation held springs like this one all along the base of the sandstone where wind and erosion had cut narrow canyons into the rock. These springs came from deep within the earth, and the people relied upon them even when the sky was barren and the winds were hot and dusty." In fact, in a later novel of hers called Gardens in the Dunes, which is set in the 19th century, Silko brings her indigenous protagonist to Europe, where she encounters ancient springs and pagan history in the British Isles and the Mediterranean. The association of springs and the sacred holds true on the Llano Estacado as well. When in 1853, the Whipple expedition, which was looking for a southern railroad bed, crossed the Texas Panhandle, they stopped to admire petroglyphs and pictographs of Rocky Dell on Agua Piedra Creek in Oldham County, which are located at or near springs that head that creek. The party met a group of traveling Tiguex or San Domingo Pueblo peoples who were traveling to trade with the Comanches. These Puebloans knew the spot well, reporting to Whipple, quote, "This place was once a favorite buffalo range, and where their fathers hunted, feasted, and danced, and then, sitting by the waterside, recorded their thoughts and deeds upon the rocks." This site, I should add, includes many images suggestive of different tribal authorship and different historical periods. The Puebloans interpreted key images, notably a 13-foot-long plumed serpent pictograph for Whipple's party, remarking that the images are placed there to sanctify the spot and to secure a perpetual supply of water. The serpent in particular, they said, was the great water snake created by Montezuma to create rain. I've never been to Rocky Dell, but I would really like to get there someday. Plains tribes like the Antelope Creek culture and Lipan Apache on the plains were at times sedentary and agricultural during wetter periods. And then during drier periods, other tribes, including Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and associated Southern Plains peoples, were nomadic. Yet nomadic inhabitation of the region does not preclude a sense of territoriality and tenure. Colonial military forces who were struck by the ability of Comanche and other tribes to vanish into what they saw as hostile desert terrain supports the idea that the indigenous people, even during drought periods, knew where to find the plentiful springs in the Llano Estacado and moved from water place to water place with relative ease. If you know the story of the Buffalo Soldier tragedy, it's sometimes called, of 1877, that's a story that provides dramatic evidence of this idea. Scholars like Daniel Jello and William Meadows document Comanche and Apache ethnographic landscapes. Both note the importance of water features, including reliable springs. Comanches marked several routes across the Llano Estacado by means of reliable water, including one from the Portales Valley to the head springs of the Brazos and Colorado rivers, including corridors rich in springs from Agua Corriente, or running water draw, the Blanco Canyon, or alternatively Agua Negra, or Blackwater draw, to Yellow House draw, where we are here, including Ransom Canyon. Jello also relates details of places in Wardsville Draw and Seminole Draw in Gaines County, where Comanches dug as many as 50 watering holes to the water table, including some large enough in the bank to ride a horse into. In Kiowa language, spring or seep was totep or totepka. White Clay Springs, for example, was Teltotep in Kiowa, probably referring to the source of the Tierra Blanca or Ojo Blanco Creek. Meadows notes that because of the bioregional challenge of aridity, Kiowa water landscape terminology emphasized seasonal or cyclical reliability. He says, whereas Euro-Americans distinguish creeks and rivers on the basis of length, Kiowa did so on the basis of continual presence or absence of water. Another early European-American traveler across the Panhandle from Bent's Fort in Colorado, southeastward across the country, he was dispatched by Fremont, the Fremont exploration in 1845, to explore southern routes across the territory and investigate the elusive headwaters of the Red River. Well, the company mainly followed the lush Canadian River and found ample water flowing there. At times, they had to cross dry prairie, and their arrival at springs is cause for celebration. Arriving at what was probably Naravisa, just west of the Texas line in New Mexico, Hebert writes of traversing a barren waste without sign of water until, quote, at length we caught sign of some tall cottonwood. The sight of their green branches peeping over the sand buttes dispelled all our fears, for in a little while, after reaching a beautiful valley, we found a clear, cold spring, which of late had been an unusual occurrence. Our camp was formed under a grove of unusually tall cottonwoods, the characteristic sylva of the region, and which heavily timbered the course of the rill which flowed from the spring. And so they go from there down the Canadian, and then they have to leave the Canadian again to cross over to the Washita, which was another dry, anxious period, until, quote, a long line of bluffs was now visible, and with elastic rapidity, all our forebodings vanished. The camp was completely metamorphosed from gloomy despair to glad delight. Some laughed, some whistled, others sang, and the loud crack of the teamster's whip told more than words could convey. All laughed at their fears as we descended onto the breaks of the headwaters of the Washita. Springs became the basis of controversy over the ongoing question of the headwaters of the Red River. Randolph Marcy's 1852 description of the headwaters he found is excessively romantic, and as scholars like Dan Flores and John Miller Morris have documented, completely inaccurate. It's probable that Marcy was at Toole Canyon, 125 miles from the Red's more nondescript sort of headwaters of the Prairie Dog Town Fork, the Elm Fork in the north and Salt Fork. But Toole is the most dramatic canyon in the escarpment complex, and Marcy declared a spring near the head of Toole Canyon its origin, writing that the canyon narrowed until the walls were, quote, only a few yards apart and finally united overhead, leaving a long, narrow corridor beneath, at the base of which the head spring of the principal or main branch of the Red River takes its rise. This spring burst out from its cavernous reservoir, and leaping down over the huge masses of rock below, here commences its long journey to unite with other tributaries in making the Mississippi the noblest river in the universe. Not until the Ruffner expedition of 1887 was Marcy's hoax, as Dan Flores calls it, corrected. And Ruffner's more prosaic description makes clear the more subtle and various ways in which the Red River takes its rise from the Llano landscape. Springs were, of course, very important to ranchers. And ranches were designed around watered lands. As Donald Green has explained, it is significant that the first settlers who moved into the region did not settle on the plains, Estacado perhaps being an exception. Numerous canyons formed from the headwaters of such important Texas rivers as the Brazos, the Red, and the Colorado are carved into the eastern escarpment. In addition, the Canadian River cuts a wide, jagged valley through the North Texas high plains. Stands of cottonwood and cedar grew along the edges of streams, and water, although somewhat brackish, was sufficient for watering stock and for human consumption. The first trickle of settlers built homes along these streams. Mexican sheepmen, led by Casimiro Romero, drifted down the Canadian River from the New Mexico Territory as early as 1876 and established in the valley of the Canadian a village which became known as Tascosa. Mobeetie, reported to be the first permanent settlement in the Panhandle, which is, by the way, a Comanche place name, was established in 1875 on Sweetwater Creek in Wheeler County. And in 1878, a group of Methodists founded a religious colony at Clarendon on the Salt Fork of the Red. The first settler in the South Plains region, the southern part of the Texas High Plains, was Hank Smith, who established a ranch in Blanco Canyon along the banks of the White River, which is a fork of the Brazos. Also famously, Charles Goodnight in 1875 and 76 took up residence in Paladro Canyon. Goodnight's first temporary headquarters, a half dugout built into the side of the bank of a stream, was a location chosen due to the location of a good spring. And the spring, soon known as Home Spring, supplied water to the dwelling, and the stream flowed on to the Red River. Later, as we learned from Goodnight's biographers, the new ranch headquarters established in 1878 were also at a spring site. This is likely the one known as J.A. Springs, which ceased flowing long since. This place is none of those that I just mentioned, but it's on a tributary of the Canadian. And in the familiar narrative, the farmers followed the ranchers, and civilization followed the plow. But despite the old adage, rain did not follow the plow. And we soon learned the perils of farming the plains: drought, overplowing, and dust bowl. So after World War II, people got serious about large volume pumping of groundwater, seeking to drought-proof the plains. Since then, as we know, declining groundwater has killed or diminished many or perhaps most springs and creeks on the plains. And this is true all over the plains, on the south or the central as well as the southern plains. There's been a spate of studies and articles recently about dry stream beds in eastern Colorado and Kansas recently. Rivers that used to flow perennially but now are dry. The Arkansas, the Republican, the Platte, and other rivers historically flowed more strongly as they proceeded because they were fed by so many springs along the way. Now these rivers are running out. A fairly recent report has it that the Platte River was only 16% of its historical flow at its confluence with the Missouri. Coming home to our southern plains here, the springs in our region primarily flow, of course, from the Ogallala Aquifer, or alternatively from the Dockham Aquifer below it, which is smaller, further down, and more brackish. Springs flow out of saturated sedimentary layers cut by streams that have traversed the Llano Estacado, or even more commonly out of the canyons carved into the escarpment. In the case of the Ogallala, these subterranean waters are referred to as fossil water. The water is held in sediment that was laid down over eons, 10 to 13 million years ago, when rivers flowed west from the Rockies and across the plains, where massive deposits of river and windborne sediment, silt, clay, and pebbles washed out from the eroding mountains and lay down over the plains. Over a period occurring less than 1 million years ago, the ancestral Pecos River eroded its way north and cut off the Brazos and other rivers that had flowed from the ancestral Rockies. These eastward channels were then buried and forgotten, and the buried sediment over time collected water. A calcareous caprock, we know as caliche, formed in our region over those sedimentary layers, resisting erosion and thus holding those waters in place between the Pecos on the west and the rolling prairies on the east. This caprock, however, is also difficult for water to permeate, meaning that aquifer recharge is relatively low. The Canadian River, which still, of course, flows from the Rockies and across the Panhandle, is the northern boundary of the Llano Estacado and separates our region of the Ogallala from the larger body of the Ogallala to the north. The modern Red, Pease, Brazos, and Colorado rivers, beheaded, now flow not from the Rockies, but from Ogallala Springs. Other springs in our region flow from the Dockham, and in rarer cases from shallow perched aquifers. While recharge is slow in human years, it's nothing in geological terms. Estimates, I'm told, are that even in our current climate regime, which is pretty dry, if all pumping were to magically cease, it would take about 300 years for the aquifer to completely refill. Prior to the pumping that happened after World War II, in other words, the aquifer was effectively full and overflowing, even during periods of relative drought. The aquifer would never deplete except for our modern usage, which is almost entirely agricultural, of course. We're standing here in the house that fiber built, so I'm not trying to trash agriculture either. Take, for example, this is Buffalo Spring in Dallam County, in the northwest corner of the Panhandle, very near the Oklahoma border. This spring was historically, by all accounts, a glorious watery place, the site of a major Indian village that has apparently never been properly surveyed. Later, a nearby area became the site of the first headquarters of that division of the XIT. Writing in the late 1970s, Gunnar Brun emphasized its historical biodiversity. He says, "The area around the spring formerly swarmed with wildlife, including bison, antelope, deer, wild mustang, introduced by Spanish explorers, wolves, prairie dogs, rabbits, many varieties of fish, geese, ducks, cranes, shorebirds, and coots. With the disappearance of most of the springs and the loss of their natural habitat, many of these animals can no longer survive in the area. Still," this is in 1878 or so, "according to the U.S. Forest Service, 6 species of turtles, 9 lizards, 28 snakes, 4 salamanders, 5 toads, and 4 frog species may be found in the Rita Blanca National Grassland." I would be curious what that count would look like today. Buffalo Springs is typical of all springs in that they are, as source of water, also source of biodiversity. As springs dry, biodiversity diminishes and ecological webs are broken. Very near where we sit here was a great vast spring that the New Mexican pioneers on the plains knew as La Punta de Agua, or the source of water, as documented in various Spanish sources and maps. George Springer settled here in 1881, establishing a store. The site was part of this well-watered Yellow House Canyon, which also includes Ransom. The city of Lubbock grew up at this site, and the springs became known as Lubbock Springs, which fed a large perennial pool known as Lubbock Lake. By the 1930s, the lake was about empty. The spring flow much diminished by early groundwater pumping for civic and agricultural use. So in 1936, the city of Lubbock dredged the lake in an effort to bring the waters back. They did hit some water, but not very much. But they found a vast wealth of paleontological and archaeological artifacts, 12,000 years worth of preserved human history. And that, of course, became known as the Lubbock Lake National Monument, or I might have that wrong. By 1950, according to Gunnar Brun, the spring no longer flowed. I stopped by there on the way here today to confirm my sources, and found there's actually quite a nice little pool there in the area that was scraped out back in the 30s. And the person I quickly interviewed there said that water is pretty reliable, that it's been there for the 8 years that she's worked there. So that's a good thing. I started off talking about springs and the sacred, and springs as a life source. And I'm really struck in doing this research that often this tone of relief and wonder and joy expressed by early narratives concerning springs and creeks, whether it's explorers or travelers or early settlers. Especially at sites where springs flow, enabled by a deep pool, these were campsites for thirsty travelers and livestock, places of meeting and trade, places of cultural value where people swam and played and celebrated and baptized. We have lost this sense of the landscape almost entirely by now. And perhaps our sense of the sacred can be carried into the present and the future by re-inhabiting our landscape and rejuvenating it. I found some nice old postcards. I think these are Dreamland Falls, which is under Lake Tanglewood now, which is a reservoir supplied by Amarillo and Canyon wastewater, which will probably be recycled someday soon. Here's another great shot of Dreamland Falls. This is my favorite. Can't really see that guy, but he's holding a great big long fishing pole. Good fishing in the Tierra Blanca. And in fact, I've seen reports of 10-pound bass being pretty regular in that creek. And another favorite, Lover's Retreat near Live Water in Paladuro. So these early photos and postcards document the importance of these water places for aesthetic and cultural and religious values. All part of our our commonwealth, right, Daryl? And as we replace these natural springs with diesel engines and pipe well bores, we've lost our sense of the sacred in that doing, and the ecological as well. Replacing a natural system with a mechanical one. And of course, something, for all intents, sustainable with something unsustainable. Two towns here in the Southern Plains are named for springs, Roaring Springs and Big Springs. Both of these are historically very important places. Big springs that have diminished or effectively ceased in terms of natural function. Roaring Springs, so named because early travelers could hear its gushing waters from miles away. Produced very steadily. Though far from its historical flow, it ran between 25 and 60 liters per second between 1937 and 1978. Like Roaring Springs, but even more so now, I think Big Spring was a major indigenous camping ground and meeting ground, well known to all tribes of the region over a very long period, millennia. And it became a significant place for traders and explorers and military and other travelers of the plains. However, Howard County has just the western edge of the Ogallala Formation, and the spring, while powerful, was very delicate. Even by 1900, the city of Big Spring began pumping groundwater from other wells to supplement the shrinking spring pool. The spring failed by 1925. Today, the spring is kept flowing artificially as a historic and scenic site for the community and tourism. Overall, that Southern Plains country below the Caprock was well watered back in the day. Childress apparently reported they were receiving 3 million gallons per day down Kittiquay Creek in the 1940s, which is amazing. That, of course, was just before that era of Ogallala pumping. Some springs certainly do flow. One that's both well documented in its historical importance and which flows to this day is Tecovas Spring. Tecovas, that is not Tecovas. I think I don't have this slide. Tecovas is a corruption of Spanish techados or tents, though other sources gloss it as lodge skins. The name reflects, again, the New Mexican pioneer history, as the place was a noted Comanchero trading site, and then later in the 1870s, the location of a stone and adobe plaza inhabited by pastores. Josiah Gregg, the Santa Fe trader, was known to camp at this site as well. In 1881, the spring became the centerpiece of the Frying Pan Ranch. In addition to the fortuitous circumstances of its geology and placement, the fact that the spring still flows must be a credit to the Frying Pan's management of its lands. According to Charles Sorrell, the spring was the largest on the ranch and flowed at 500 gallons per minute from its single opening. Brune reports that the 1881 flow of 32 liters per second had been reduced to 2.5 liters per second in 1978. The spring was developed with a hydraulic ram that pumped water to the ranch house, and the spring was enclosed in a pump house. On the building is a historical marker that reads, Tecovas Spring Frying Pan Headquarters, 1880-1897. Four men here held the first election in Potter County, 1887. In 1881, when William H. Bush visited here, these men were on the payroll of the first ranch fenced in North Texas. And then it lists the names. And then it says, before 1880, Mexican sheep herders made camp here, helped preserve this landmark of the plains. And this is kind of a homemade historical marker that's mounted onto the pump house where that spring still flows. Tecovas was a location known and used by, again, all travelers of the plains for millennia, though today it's safely preserved on private land, and its waters support a ranch dedicated to sustainable soil, water, and grass conservation. Brune mentions that the pool below the spring is abundant in watercress. According to its present owner, the watercress and also mint was planted by Mrs. Katie Wetzel of upstate New York. Along with her husband, Warren Wetzel, who was the first manager of the ranch, Katie lived in a dugout at the spring as of 1882. She used her watercress and mint medicinally, as she was by default the amateur physician of the whole prairie region. I've had the pleasure of visiting there a couple of times, once in the company of Paul Carlson, the noted Texas Tech professor of history, and both times in a party of very enthusiastic visitors. The opportunity to go see a functioning spring and live water flowing and this sort of green fecund space where there's watercress and mint growing will definitely draw a crowd. And Tecovas is not the only one. To the north, near the Canadian River in Hutchinson County, is 42 Steps Spring, which is one of my favorites. This spring gushes from a dry creek bed that cuts across a terrace as this stream makes its way down to the Canadian. Even in the midst of our current drought, a mega drought that scientists call the worst drought in 1,200 years, this spring is flowing strongly. It seems to be a local peculiarity of the geology, perhaps a fault in the beds there that keeps the spring flow strong. The water emerges from the base of the Ogallala Formation where it meets underlying Permian shales. So this was just this February. I mean, this one. Okay, on the left was 2014 in the summer, and on the right, that picture was taken in February of this year, where the water comes over the fall. It's a beautiful place, and still flint and other artifacts all over the place. So just to wind up here, we need to preserve our springs as well as our playas, I think, although it's perhaps even more challenging. Not as artificial, but as natural water sources, as living systems of water. When we lose springs, we lose historical knowledge, artifacts, and memory. We lose the historical landscape. And when we lose springs as well, we lose an ecosystem, replacing a natural system with a hydrological machine of pipes and pumps that is only geared toward drawdown. That's an abrupt conclusion, but thank you very much for listening, and we'll go from there. Sure. Yeah, any comments or questions, happy to try to answer.
This is very ignorant question because I don't understand
Yeah. Generally speaking, yeah.
Okay, so, I mean, where does it go? If it's gone forever, should you plug it up so it's not taking from the aquifer?
Well, I mean, that's one argument, right? I mean, some people say that if you're just letting the spring flow, you're wasting water that we could be pumping for agriculture, right? The case I'm trying to make is that it's a good thing to have live water flowing because it sustains an ecosystem that otherwise is gone. Right? So it's a question of how and for what we value that water.
Because that goes into other rivers.
Right. Yeah, it's going to flow into the Red or the Brazos or whatever.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Hunt, have you been to? Are you familiar with Camp Springs, community in the locale of Camp Springs?
No, I'm not.
In eastern Scurry County, down off the Cap east here.
I've not been there. Sounds like I should, huh?
General Robert E. Lee, he was a colonel prior to the Civil War. Colonel Robert E. Lee was said to have lived right there several times when he was stationed at garrisons here in Texas, around the parts of Texas at that time. And he said to have lived right there, and it was a very good live spring. Camp Springs,
Scurry County.
You might want to
Okay.
investigate that.
I shall.
I know several landowners in that vicinity. I don't know who actually owns the property at this time where that spring actually is.
Oh, well, maybe I can bend your ear later and we can talk about that. In the back.
Back to Hutchinson County in the spring, I do know that regional water plan, that Hutchinson County is one of the counties that said they want 80% of their water left in 50 years. And so they are making a concerted effort to use waters there, not pump the water, and actually develop an area for Jordan and places like that. So it's definitely been a decision by that county to preserve the area, to invest in the building, and go back to some of the landowners that have decided to go back to sustainable ranching so that they can do that. And it's working. I mean, they've had that plan if you go back and look at the Texas water plan and you look at it for Region 8, they've had that plan in there for 2 or 3 plans back.
Yeah,
So
that's great.
10 to 15 years.
They're blessed with very broken country, right? Which saves the water in the end. So, yeah, I think you make an excellent point.
Happening, at least up here on High Plains.
Yeah.
People trying to think about that.
Yeah, and that's great. And decisions that are made in terms of how people want to manage their land can help restore springs. In the back, in the purple? No? Daryl?
Alex, what do you make of Cedar Canyon and those springs?
Well, it's a pretty awesome place. I've actually only been in there once. And I was with a geologist, which was kind of nice. So I got to, we hiked down the draw and drank from a Dockham spring right out of the rock, which was a really neat experience. I always drink from the springs, even though they can be contaminated, of course. But I like to taste that water. Anyway, back to your question. I mean, Cedar Canyon is gorgeous, and when I was there was a lot of water there, and a beautiful waterfall, and it's wonderful that it's preserved as a church camp, so that younger people can see that and have that as part of their understanding of their legacy of their landscape, their bioregion. Yes, ma'am. The jean jacket.
Was that back by Bunches Springs?
Uh-huh. Well, it's dammed. Right.
Like this. Is that really the overall aquifer, or is that the accumulation of water draining in a certain direction, like through the canyon?
Well, I think we'll learn about that this afternoon. I don't really know. I mean, I think it's historically certainly a spring-fed area, but it's also part of a larger canyon system. So it would have had stream flow coming down as well as springs feeding into it. Now it's dammed, and I think there's water being pumped up from the Ogallala artificially. Is that correct?
So Talking about Buffalo Lake.
Buffalo Lake.
Wildlife Refuge.
Oh, I thought we were talking about Buffalo Lake here in Lubbock.
Right, not Buffalo Springs, but Buffalo, the one in Canyon.
Oh, the one on the Tierra Blanca. Okay, so that one, yes, that was a dam put on Tierra Blanca Draw. It was made possible by water flowing in the creek from springs, as well as rainwater and wastewater runoff. And it failed because of the death of springs, basically. It also became contaminated because of
Fecal
Right.
cattle farm from feedlots in Hereford.
right
That's all just very recent within the last, well, since
1980s.
the 50s or 60s.
Yeah. So now it's empty except for a little bit of rainwater pool, I guess. I'm not sure I answered your question, but yes, sir.
I have a question about the water quality of the springs.
Ooh.
If they're tied to the Ogallala Aquifer and the Doggo, as we're depleting these resources via agriculture, at least on our farm, we're noticing a concentration of things like magnesium and calcium. Are you also seeing that in some of these springs? I realize you're a little further up north, but is there a relationship? Are you seeing that at all? Or are there other contaminated issues going on here?
I'm really the wrong one to ask on this. I'm sorry. I don't know the answer to that question. In Gunnar Brune's book, he talks about sort of the regional quality of spring water coming out of the Ogallala Aquifer, and he mentions the elements that you're mentioning, right? Calcium, magnesium, so forth. The concentrations, though, I have no notion of. I know that one of the things that kills a reservoir is that when the reservoir drops, the water quality is reduced because all of that residual stuff is down at the bottom. I can't really imagine that the Ogallala works the same way, but I don't know. Sorry, I'm rambling because I don't know, so I should stop talking. Sorry. Any other questions?
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by, you used the phrase fossil water. And could you just sort of, which water is fossil water? Is water that comes up in a spring fossil water, or what's the distinction?
My understanding is that if you had to put a date on it, if you're drinking water from the Ogallala, that water is probably several thousand years old. Not nearly as old as the sediment beds that it's trapped in. So it does trickle down and it does flow out. But the term fossil, to me, it suggests that it's, in practical terms, it's finite and it's not recharging in such a way that people recognize it as a dynamic water flow system. So I think the term fossil water refers to the fact that, or the idea that I expressed, that in geological terms, it only takes a few hundred years for water to recharge the aquifer. That's not very old, but in terms of our human time frames, that water is fossil in the sense that it was originally laid down by sources that are no longer available and only recharged by sources that happen very slowly. Yeah.
I don't know if it's true or not, but at Slide Road in about 73rd or 74th, there's a park, and it has a pond in it. And I have been told that is spring fed. Do you know if that's true or not?
No, there's probably a local who could answer that better than me. But if it's a park that's part of the Yellow House Draw system, it may well be. There may well be a little spring seeping there. Or it could be a place where Lubbock street runoff water gathers. I don't know. Yeah.
It does seem to stay,
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty good indication that it's probably a little seeping spring. Yes.
How were you able to get all these amazing photos at different springs? Were you the one taking these photos?
Yeah, mostly. These are my photos. These are from the internet. Most of them I found online, actually. I'm giving another talk on Saturday that has more of my photos from my hiking around. So these are from the archives or from the internet. These are just snapshots out of Gunnar Brune's book. This was from a seesaw field trip. Isn't this great? This was on a boulder near the Canadian River. There was a lot of rock art in that area. And on the right, that's a boulder in Paladro Canyon, a place called Indian Springs. That one time I was there and there was some wet dirt there, and the next time I went, it was just dust. So it may seep occasionally. That's right below Fortress Cliffs, if you're familiar with Paladro Canyon State Park. Thank you very much.